All right, today we are going on an incredible journey. We're diving into a world that is literally all around us, and even inside of us, but is totally invisible to the naked eye. We are talking about the cell, the fundamental building block of every single living thing on Earth. So how did we even find out it exists, and what makes it all tick? Let's break it down.
First up, we'll start with the accidental discovery that basically kicked off this entire field of science. Then, we're going to cover the basic parts that almost all cells share before we zero in on the cell's control center, the nucleus. From there, we'll take a tour of the factory floor, meeting all the specialized workers we call organelles. And finally, we'll look at what makes a plant cell so different from an animal cell. So where does this story even begin? Well, it's not in some high-tech, futuristic lab. Nope. It all starts with a simple piece of cork and a really curious mind, way back in the 17th century.
And this was the moment everything changed. It's 1665, and a scientist named Robert Hooke points his own homemade microscope at a super thin slice of cork. And what he saw were these tiny box-like structures. He called them cells, which comes from the Latin word for a little room. And just like that, it was the very first time anyone had ever seen that living things were made of separate units. It seems like a small observation, but it kicked off an absolute revolution in science.
You know, Hooke's discovery was really just the beginning. It set off this amazing chain reaction. Just a few years later, another scientist, Leeuwenhoek, used a better microscope and found single, living cells just zipping around in a drop of pond water. Wild. Then, fast forward to 1831, and Robert Brown spots a really important structure inside the cell, the nucleus. This all built up to the cell theory, which then got a huge boost from Virchow's brilliant idea that, hey, cells have to come from other cells. But the biggest leap of all, that came in the 1940s when the electron microscope was invented. It finally let us peer inside and see the incredible, complex machinery at work.
So okay, we know they exist, but what is a cell actually made of? Well, it turns out that whether you're talking about an onion, an amoeba, or a person, almost every cell is built on the exact same fundamental plan. It turns out pretty much every cell has these three core features. First, there's a plasma membrane. Think of it like a bouncer or a gatekeeper, carefully controlling what gets in and what gets out. Inside that is the cytoplasm, which is this jelly-like goop that fills the cell and keeps everything cushioned. And finally, for a lot of cells, the star of the show, the nucleus, which, as we'll see, is the ultimate control center. Okay, before we dive any deeper, you really need to understand this huge split in the tree of life. On one side, you have prokaryotes, like bacteria. These guys are the minimalists. They're simple, and their genetic material just kind of floats around inside. But on the other side, you've got eukaryotes, and that's us. Plants, animals, fungi. Our cells are way bigger, way more complex, and they keep their DNA neatly tucked away inside a nucleus. Plus, we've got a whole team of other specialized compartments, and it's that complexity we're about to explore. All right. Let's zoom in on the cell's director of operations. Think of it like the head office, the CEO's suite, or the brain of the entire operation. We're talking about the nucleus. So the nucleus isn't just a storage container. It has two incredibly important jobs. First, it holds the master blueprint for cellular reproduction. You know, the process where one cell divides into two. And second, it directs all the chemical activities of the cell. It's essentially telling the cell what to do, when to grow, and what to become. So if we peek inside this control center, we find a few key things. It's protected by a double-layered nuclear membrane, which has these little pores that act like security gates for stuff coming in and out. Inside that are the chromosomes. These are the tightly coiled structures of DNA and protein. And that DNA, well, that's the master blueprint. It has all the information needed to build and run the entire cell. And the little functional bits of that DNA are what we call genes, the instructions that decide our traits. Okay, so if the nucleus is the head office, then the rest of the cell is like a buzzing, bustling factory floor. It is filled with these specialized workers called organelles, and each one has a very specific and very vital job to do. So first up on our tour is the cell's internal highway system for manufacturing and transport, the endoplasmic reticulum, or just the ER. This huge network of tubes actually comes in two flavors. You've got the rough ER, which is called rough because it's covered in these tiny protein-making factories called ribosomes. Then you've got the smooth ER, which handles fats and lipids. Fun fact, in your liver cells, the smooth ER is also what helps detoxify poisons and drugs. The whole network then acts like a highway, moving all these new materials around the cell. So once the ER makes all this stuff, where does it go?
Well, it gets sent to the cell's postal service, the Golgi apparatus.
So imagine this stack of flattened sacks, kind of like pancakes. Here, the products that came from the ER get modified, sorted, and packaged up. It's basically the final quality check and the shipping department, all in one. It makes sure every protein and lipid gets a shipping label and is sent to its correct destination, whether that's inside the cell or somewhere else in the body.
Now, every good factory needs a cleanup crew. And in the cell, that job belongs to an organelle with a really dramatic nickname, the suicide bag. Let's talk about lysosomes.
These little sacs are filled with super powerful digestive enzymes, which makes them the cell's waste disposal and recycling center. They break down foreign invaders like bacteria and digest old, worn-out cell parts. So why the crazy nickname? Well, if the cell gets severely damaged or infected, the lysosomes can actually burst, and their enzymes will digest the entire cell from the inside out. It's a pretty dramatic but very effective self-destruct mechanism.
Of course, none of this work, not the building, the transporting, or the cleaning, can happen without energy. And that brings us to the most famous organelles of all, the powerhouses of the cell, the mitochondria. Mitochondria are absolute masters of energy conversion. They take the food we eat and transform it into the cell's energy currency, a molecule called ATP. Literally every move you make, every thought you have, is powered by ATP made by your mitochondria. Without them, the entire cellular factory would just grind to a halt.
Okay, so we've toured the factory, but not all of these complex cells are built exactly the same. So for our final section, let's look at the key differences that set plant cells and animal cells apart. This table lays it all out pretty clearly. You can see that while animal cells are kind of flexible and irregular, plant cells have three huge features they don't: a rigid outer cell wall, energy-making plastids like chloroplasts for photosynthesis, and a massive central vacuole. And that first feature, the cell wall, is arguably the most important difference of them all. So this is the cell wall. It's this tough, rigid layer made of cellulose that sits outside the plasma membrane. It's the reason a tree has its strength and what allows a flower to stand up straight. This wall also provides an incredible defense. It allows a plant cell to absorb huge amounts of water and not burst, something that would make an animal cell just pop.
So what's the big takeaway here? It's that a cell is so much more than just a bag of parts. Its ability to live comes from the incredible organization of all these membranes and organelles working together in perfect harmony. It is both the fundamental structural unit, the bricks, and the fundamental functional unit, the workers, of all known life.
And that leaves us with a really fascinating question to chew on. We've just seen how membranes and all these organelles create the beautiful complexity of life. So what does that make viruses? They don't have any membranes, no organelles, no machinery of their own. They just exist in this weird gray area, totally lifeless until they hijack one of our cells and use its factory. It's a puzzle that really challenges the very definition of what it means to be alive.